Hello, and welcome to C.A.R.'s Legislative Day. My name is Janet Dorsey, the chair of California Association of Realtors Fair Housing and Diversity Task Force. On Legislative Day, realtors converge on Sacramento to share our priorities and stories with lawmakers. C.A.R.'s legislative priorities often include advocating for fair housing issues to ensure that homeownership remains affordable and accessible for everyone. This has not always been the case. At one time, C.A.R. membership was restricted. Women and people of color were not welcomed. Realtors encouraged discriminatory practices such as steering, redlining, and blockbusting. Realtors introduced laws that made it difficult to build affordable housing and opposed laws that would make it illegal to discriminate. Thankfully, we've made progress. Although many forms of discrimination have long been illegal and C.A.R. members are as diverse as the state of California, we still have a long way to go to undo the effects of the legal discrimination that this organization once supported. Past discriminatory policies and practices, along with our current scarce supply and low affordability, have only caused these homeownership gaps to widen. A study released by the Federal Reserve in 2020 found the accumulated assets of a Black family was less than 15% of white families. And the biggest factor driving the accumulation of wealth is whether a family owns their own home. In fact, according to a 2020 report of the US Census, homeowners' median wealth was 89 times larger than the median wealth of renters. A C.A.R. study released in February shows that an abysmally small percentage of Black and Latinx families can afford to purchase a home here. In fact, only 20% of Latinx and 19% of Black households can afford to buy a median-priced home. Although California's Asian American and Pacific Islander, also known as AAPI homeownership rate, is relatively high, the numbers don't tell the full story. The AAPI community is incredibly diverse, including over 50 ethnicities. And according to the Asian American Real Estate Association of America, the national AAPI subgroup homeownership rates range around 30 to 35% to 68%. All of the AAPI communities highlighted lagged behind the white homeownership rate. Past discrimination kept many families from achieving homeownership in California, while giving others an unfair advantage in a housing market that is characterized by low supply and very high demand. People of color and other underserved groups in the past and still today have a more difficult time achieving homeownership. Additionally, continued bias and discrimination exacerbates these disparities, perpetuating large racial homeownership and wealth gaps. Today, we are going to hear 5 personal stories from our realtor community on fair housing and discrimination issues. Our first video is from Matt DeFanis, the 2018 president of the Illinois Realtors. He shares his journey to understanding the magnitude of the fair housing issues still plaguing underserved communities. He offers advice on how we can all take action to end bias and discrimination and to close racial homeownership gaps.
Hi, California Realtors. I'm Matt DeFanis coming to you from Champaign, Illinois. That's a small metro area in the cornfields of central Illinois, about 130 miles south of Chicago. We're home to the flagship campus of the University of Illinois. I'm here to talk to you today about my own personal journey with respect to issues of housing discrimination, the significant work left for us to do on fair housing, and the continued differences between white America, Black America, and other communities of color. If you're watching me on video, you can tell that I'm a white guy. I'm in my mid-40s, so I was born years after fair housing had become the law of the land. Fair housing, to me, was ancient history, something I needed to know enough about to pass my licensing exam and continuing education classes. Sure, I was vaguely aware that there had been inequity in the past, but the Fair Housing Act was passed, the playing field had since been leveled, and the American dream of homeownership was available to anyone willing to work hard enough. Thanks to a highly improbable journey over the last few years, this is no longer my perspective, and that journey is what I'm here to share. I had the privilege of serving as the 2018 president of the Illinois Realtors, and while your state is much larger than mine, both our states are extremely diverse. When I started on the Illinois Realtors leadership team in 2016, issues of inclusion were nowhere on my radar. The board of directors was 100% white and overwhelmingly male in both 2016 and 2017. When I first landed at that board table, I didn't intrinsically recognize this as a problem. After all, to someone who looks like me, a table full of white people looks a lot like a family reunion. Two key factors led to my gradually becoming aware of the glaring lack of inclusion I had initially overlooked. The first was exposure to the history of housing discrimination, and the second factor was transformative friendships with industry leaders who don't look like me. Since my year as state president coincided with the 50-year anniversary of the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968, the Illinois Realtors had planned for some commemorative activities. In 2017, this gave me my first exposure to the awful, shameful history of housing discrimination and the Realtors' role in it. Around that time, a project called Mapping Inequality digitized the infamous Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining maps, posting them in an interactive format in devastating full color. These were the maps, largely drawn by realtors and appraisers, that condemned entire neighborhoods largely based on the skin color of the residents. Even worse, the margin notes, again typically written by realtors and appraisers, often describe black residents in terms analogous to an infestation of rats. Utterly dehumanizing, and the realtors' fingerprints were all over it. I had the privilege of serving as the NAR 2020 Professional Standards Chair, so that's a 100-plus member committee that collectively serves as the keeper of the Code of Ethics. But for decades, early versions of the code contained a housing discrimination mandate. That is, realtors could be brought up on ethics charges and sanctioned if they failed to engage in housing discrimination. Former Article 34 stated a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values. The last vestiges of that awful discriminatory language were not fully eradicated from the code until 1974. That is 6 years after fair housing had become the law of the land. Why so long? Because the realtors had fought strenuously against fair housing. My continued efforts to learn this history have included the must-read book by Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. That book combines meticulous research with gut-wrenching anecdotes that detail the horrors of housing discrimination on individual people and families. I mentioned earlier, my community is home to a Big Ten research university. Champaign-Urbana is extraordinarily diverse. This is the sort of place that couldn't possibly have housing discrimination. But that bubble burst one day in 2018 on the sidelines of a fair housing event where I had spoken in Chicago. A black female HUD attorney, someone literally in the fair housing business, introduced herself to me, having heard me say I was from Champaign. It turns out we went to the same high school. Her mom was a universally beloved guidance counselor, and I had even had some classes with her younger sister. Kimberly told me Champaign was where she experienced her first housing discrimination. She told me I don't sound black on the phone. So time after time, she would call to inquire about available rentals, and time after time, when a black woman showed up to see them, they were mysteriously not available. So I was confronted with the realization that housing discrimination happens everywhere and persists well into the era of supposedly fair housing. After some transformative friendships with brown and black colleagues had gotten me past my own blind spot, I'd started agitating for increased inclusion in the realtor organization. But that led to discovering more blind spots. It turns out there was a glass ceiling, which I had never seen, until I watched people I care about bounce off of it. While we had been claiming to want more inclusion for years, nearly all of my black colleagues have experienced showing up at a realtor event only to be the only black person in the room and to have no one speak to them. I became determined to engage in meaningful outreach aimed at improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. I didn't have a roadmap except for a sense of what had failed to work in the past. I decided the traditional idea of outreach rang hollow if we claimed to want more inclusion, to want to bring people who don't look like me to my table, if I weren't willing to spend some time at their tables, if they would have me. To that end, I became meaningfully involved in all of the minority and multicultural real estate trade groups in my state, with a particular emphasis on outreach to the black community. In a relatively short period of time, I went from apprehensive at the prospect of being the only person in the room who looks like me to being totally accustomed to it. I won't ever know what it's like to sell real estate while Black, but through these transformative friendships, Black colleagues have given me a front row seat and have pulled back the curtain so I could at least get a good look at the persistent and appalling differences between white America and Black America, the differences between selling real estate while white and selling real estate while Black. Here are the most striking observations that have confronted me. The gap between Black homeownership and white homeownership is today about the same as it was before the Fair Housing Act. Black colleagues typically have to work twice as hard for half the pay due to lower dollar and more complex transactions. Black colleagues tend to have diversified businesses out of necessity so they can cobble together a living by cobbling together brokerage, property management, construction, rehabbing, and development. My Black colleagues have to be more flexible and resilient than anything I could have ever imagined from my own personal industry experience. Black wealth continues to lag far behind that of whites, largely reflecting the impact of that home ownership gap on net worth. And most of these disparities, even today, can be directly traced to the ongoing hangover effects of discriminatory housing policies of the past that have realtor fingerprints all over them. All this is to say that issues of fair housing remain as current for us today as ever. I hear lots of white colleagues who express frustration over a perception of being held responsible for the sins of people generations ago. And I'd like to share an analogy from another must-read book, Isabel Wilkerson's 2020 book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontent. We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. And any further deterioration is, in fact, on our hands. Unaddressed, the ruptures and diagonal cracks will not fix themselves. The toxins will not go away, but rather will spread, leach, and mutate as they already have. When people live in an old house, they come to adjust to the idiosyncrasies and outright dangers skulking in an old structure. They put buckets under a wet ceiling, prop up groaning floors, learn to step over that rotting wood tread in the staircase. The awkward becomes acceptable. The unacceptable becomes merely inconvenient. Live with it long enough, and the unthinkable becomes normal. Exposed over the generations, we learn to believe that the incomprehensible is the way that life is supposed to be. Again, those are the wise words of Isabel Wilkerson. Realtor colleagues, I've learned over the last few years that if you look like me, most of what I've described hides outside of our field of view. That means our own senses are telling us, erroneously, that we don't have a problem. My improbable recent life journeys have simultaneously broken my heart and inspired me. I now feel the weight of knowing I won't live long enough to see the damage inflicted by our industry fully undone. But it also motivates me to do all that I can to help repair that house that we have all inherited.
Matt's story is heartfelt and compelling. He demonstrates what an ally is, that we don't always realize what we don't know unless we take the time to truly listen and spend time with people from different communities. Our next story comes from Eva Garcia. A realtor since the early 1960s, she has held many prominent positions in the real estate and business communities. In 1981, Eva became the first Latina president of the California chapter of Women's Council of Realtors. 40 years later, her daughter continues to break down barriers as the second Latina to step into the same role.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Eva Garcia, and I'm the broker of Garcia Realty. I started my company back in 1967, and we are now 4 of us work here. My children and I, and their spouses. We do property management and residential real estate. When I first arrived to this country from Mexico in 1958, we saved enough money that I wanted to buy a house in San Bernardino, California. I walked into a real estate company and the man told me, I told him the address of the property that I had seen and that I would like to see it. And without getting up from his desk, he just told me that Mexicans could not buy in that area of town. I was thoroughly in shock because I come from Mexico City and I was brought up in an upper middle class family. And for him to tell me that I couldn't buy there because I was Mexican, I felt very offended. And so I left in tears. And I told my husband, this has to change. I mean, this is not possible. If you recall history, California used to belong to Mexico. So what is this? That now this man tells me that I cannot buy the property because I'm Mexican. In my other background, I was very involved in establishing a chapter of the National Association of Women Business Owners in Sacramento in the 80s. And then we found, it was interesting. I had a woman who was employed as the television, she worked for a television. She was an anchor in a television station. She made very good money. And she wanted to buy a house, and I went and I wrote her off with an FHA loan at that time. And when I presented the contract to FHA, they asked me, what is the husband's name? And I said, she's not married, she's single. So then she said, then the man continued to say, then we cannot sell it to her because she needs to have a husband to buy this house, FHA. And I announced to him, if you don't sell her the house, she's fully qualified. And if you don't sell her the house, I will see you in court. And she received the house. She bought the house on her name with no signature from a father, a brother, or a husband. So with that thought in mind, I began to understand that there were a lot of people that they could not qualify to get a credit card. And when I talk to younger group of women, they look at me like, what are you talking about? You could not get a credit card. You could not buy a house if you were single. You needed to have a man as a consignor. So with that in mind, through the Association of the National Women Business Owners, we contacted a congressperson to carry a bill in 1988. A bill was carried, H.R. 5050, which it tells you that you cannot discriminate to any woman that can qualify to buy a house or to get a checking account of her name, a credit card. You cannot discriminate. This bill totally canceled that thought that you had to have a husband or a father or a brother to co-sign for you. So that was something that was very fulfilling and great. And when I tell this story to younger people, so especially, they don't understand how important that is, or that you have the right, if you qualify, you have the right to own property, to open a checking account, to get a credit card on your own. Things change, sometimes little by little, but they change. And it's important for everyone selling real estate to be fair and to be aware that this right belongs to everybody who qualifies, and not to discriminate because of the color of the skin, the ancestry, or the nationality that they come from. If they're qualified, they're qualified. Period.
Next up, Realtor Karen Ruth and her client Lolita Smith share how they made homeownership possible. Lolita used the AC Boost program for down payment assistance to help her purchase her first home. These types of programs can be very helpful to first-time home buyers who don't have family to help them with down payments, particularly those with less inherited or generational wealth.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Ruth, and I'm a realtor with Berkshire Hathaway Drysdale Properties. And I'm here with one of my clients, Lolita Smith. And Lolita Smith participated in the AC Boost program, which is down payment assistant program. And she is so nice to have granted us the chance to interview her and talk about how her process has been for becoming a homeowner. So hello, Lolita. How are you?
Hello, Karen. I'm great. Really glad to take part in this process.
Oh,
It was an incredibly beneficial event for me and also rather surprising in its outcome.
well, good. So, well, my first question is to you. How did you come to the decision that you were ready to buy when you decided to buy? How did you reach that? What made you get to that point?
I'd been living as a renter for some time, like over a decade at one place, and started to, and time is going on. I'm trying to consider what my future will be like. And so I was trying to make some decisions. At first, I was just going to find another location to rent because, like most people, the idea of laying down 20% on a down payment was like halfway out of my option
Oh,
at
yeah.
that point. I also work for a nonprofit that provides affordable housing and supportive services in California, Alameda County and Contra Costa County, Sonoma County. And so I do have a little bit of a insider's view on housing availability, housing cost, barriers and all that. And I somehow just felt like I'm going to look into those resources, and that's how it began.
All right. So you mentioned the word barriers. So what sort of barriers have come or were you worried about or that might have reared their heads?
So when you're putting your name on a wait list, you have the understanding that it's going to be years probably until you receive a call back. And then for me, in terms of trying to buy a home, I was saving and saving, but it felt like I wasn't saving fast enough to keep up with the housing market. So like even if I could save 20%, by the time that I saved 20%, the actual 20% would be like 20% more than what I needed to earn. So there was that feeling of like running out of time. 1 month after putting my name on the list, I got this email about putting my name into a pre-application lottery for a down payment assistance program. And I did sit on that for a little bit of time, like at least 3 or 4 days, where I was like, really, how, one, it's a lottery. I never win anything. I work for everything. Okay. I never win anything. I might get lucky by being in the right place, but I actually never win lotteries. So I thought, oh, what's the luck of that happening? But then I thought, well, you have nothing to lose by doing it. So I decided to put my name in.
And then you found out that they had selected you and
Yes, there was a presentation for the down payment assistance program. So if your name was selected from this lottery, you were invited to this presentation. And so I got the presentation email and I was like, okay, really, how feasible is it going to be for me to obtain the whole thing? And then I didn't respond because I was like, I'm never gonna. And then I got an email about a day or two before the presentation that says, we haven't heard from you. Did you still want to go? And I was like, well, what do I have to lose? So I said I would do it. And a day after work, I drove down to Hayward for the presentation.
fantastic. All right. And so then, well, obviously you were accepted into the program.
Yes.
And you were able to start your search for your home.
Yes.
And with the help of a wonderful agent, I hope.
There were provided several realtors who had gone through a training for the AC Boost program, giving kind of an understanding of what's going to be required. I contacted them. The first one didn't go so well. I felt like she wasn't necessarily as familiar with the program as I would have felt comfortable with. And also I didn't get a lot of information from her I didn't feel like we were in the program together. And then the second one, I went through Heather Headley, who was a surprise. And she was incredibly supportive about, yes, you can do this. This is possible. And that is exactly what I needed to hear.
Yes, you wanted someone that you felt was on your
It was, yes, definitely needed somebody who was on my side and was willing to do their own work and
Right.
getting familiar with the requirements of the
Yeah.
program,
Yeah.
because I don't know, as a person who's from the outside, I'm relying on not only their real estate ability, but also their knowledge of the program. And I didn't know exactly what they did or didn't know. So I had Heather, we got the loan.
Uh-huh.
She introduced me to Karen. And then I think that was in October of 2019. And I said, should I start looking now? And Karen's like, yes, you should start looking now. And I thought, oh God, here we go. So I was on lots of online real
Right.
estate
Right. Yeah.
sites and looking at their open houses. There are certain guidelines to the Boost program that are, it has to be within a certain number of miles of a transit line. It has to be a certain distance from my work. And so that really put me into a certain area, a certain geographical area.
Right.
I looked a lot. I looked a lot in Oakland because I still felt very much connected to Oakland and I wanted to stay there. Um, but the price of the homes,
In Oakland. Yeah.
the
Were
price of the homes for the amount of loan that I had and the down payment assistance put me in a certain bracket. So like this is what I could spend. This is my price limit, my budget. And then there was the quality of the available stock that I was looking at, where it felt as though um, all that needed to happen for the presentation was to slap a couple of pages on the walls and then leave everything the way it was. There was no sort of home improvement or flip this house kind of making it look good and selling it. So I felt that there was a little house for a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so that forced me to sort of expand my search out further. I went into San Leandro, Hayward, uh, um, Union City, uh, Dublin. These are all areas where I felt I could I could possibly feel comfortable with, but they were also close enough to a transit system where I could get to work by transit if I needed to instead of driving. The prices was still a little bit of, a lot of bait and switch, I felt, where it was like there would be no information about the size of it, and you would go and it would be a studio condo and it was almost the same price as the unit that I purchased. And I thought, what is happening? And it felt like every week that I would look, because I would work during the week and then do the open houses over the weekend. So I would fit in like 3 or 4 open houses in the weekend over about a month period. And it was I felt like the prices would raise like per hour. So I'm looking through the real estate listings during the week to set up the open house opportunities on the weekend, and it felt like, I was initially looking at things that were in the $399 range, and then like a couple hours later I'm looking at things in the 400 range, and then I'm looking, it just felt like the prices were increasing minute by minute, and it felt really like a desperate situation because the program benefit was only going to last for a certain amount of time. So I had to find something within a certain amount of time as well. And I think it was I had to close within 60 days of the loan qualification or something like that. So I was feeling quite desperate as like time was going by and I was not finding things that were meeting the needs that I had: safety, transit, cost, all of those things. And then finally I got lucky one day and I was looking at 2 places in one area, and I walked in, I saw the light and I was like, this I could work with. And so it turned out I called Karen and I was like, Karen, put an offer in.
I know. Yeah. So what other things does home ownership mean to you? I mean, being the fact that you are now
A homeowner.
Yeah, exactly.
It meant that I could invest in my own life. Like it felt like not financially, but emotionally, I can put down roots somewhere. I can feel like I'm a part of a community that I can care about. Like I can contribute in that way instead of me I'm not saying throwing away money, but all of the money that I had paid in rent
Yeah.
over my lifetime,
Mhm.
I can
Mhm.
now put that money into something that actually is mine, and I can build equity, and I can, if something changes and my desires for something different changes, I have the investment to
Mhm.
actually leverage to make those future dreams happen. So
Exactly.
yeah, it was extremely important.
Yeah.
And I have a single mother who's aging as well. So I wanted to be able to have the opportunity to provide shelter and safety for her should she, choose to want to live with me. And so it wasn't just to support myself. It was actually a thing that I could support my family as well.
Our next speaker is Doug Sager, who served as the 2016 president of Oakland Berkeley Association of Realtors. He shares powerful stories about working with the LGBTQ community and how important it is to understand unconscious bias and its role in fair housing.
Hi, I'm Doug Sager. Well, I became a real estate agent because I wanted to help people making a major transition in their life, but I became a realtor because I wanted to do it right. To me, being a realtor means being part of an organization of professionals who excel at helping people through crucial points in their life while following the code of ethics. The conversation we're having now is an incredible opportunity to look deep down inside of us, to hold a mirror up to ourselves, and to see where these unconscious biases might have formed and where they exist, and really be able to shine a light on them. There are times where I have encouraged a seller to take a look at this love letter, because this love letter is really, really beautiful. Well, even in doing that little simple act, what I have basically done is I've encouraged a bias. I've encouraged an unequal playing field for housing affordability. And out of this conversation, there's a lot of practices that we will have the opportunity to look at. That being one of them that I'm pretty passionate about. When we include pictures with our offers for our buyers, that should not be allowed. The only thing it could possibly do is encourage a bias. As a member of the LGBT community, it pains my heart every time I hear of or experience a time when a same-sex couple writes an offer and they're afraid that they're going to have two male or two female names on that document for fear that a seller might discriminate against them simply because they might be, a gay or lesbian or bisexual couple. In my own experience, I wrote an offer for my mother's house, and I did write a letter. I did. In that letter, I did not refer to my mother's wife. My mother's also LGBTQ, because I was afraid that there might be that discrimination on the other side, and I did not want to lose my mother's dream home for her because of my desire or need to tell the truth. I look back on those times and I think that's one of those times you could have been more courageous. You could have been more upfront and been willing to deal with whatever circumstance came your way, because every little time that you do something like that you tell your truth, you're empowering everybody. There's a history that we have to reckon with. We were not on the right side of history. We were contributing to unfair housing practices systematically. And now with the conversations we're having, it's an opportunity to dive even deeper into our history and to talk about it freely, to acknowledge it, to accept it, and more importantly, to change it. The time is now. Realtors have not always been on the right side of history. There was a time when we systematically were part of the problem, not part of the solution. We contributed to an unlevel playing field in housing. We contributed to biases towards others. Well, now is an opportunity, with the conversations we were having, an opportunity we should all feel grateful for. It's an opportunity to look at ourselves deeper, to take a real solid look at ourselves, and to be able to look to the future and to see how we can change the times of the past, change the things that we were unfortunately part of, how we can chart new territory, fair territory, and that time is now. One of the most powerful things C.A.R. can do is educate, inspire, and encourage all of our members to be conscious at all times and shine their light in the darkness when it's needed. In this profession, we have the opportunity to call out bad actors, to call out bad legislation, and to call out bad policy and business practices that contribute to an unlevel playing field with regards to fair housing. We have the power to make the change. Together, we can advance homeownership for all. Together, we have the power to make a difference. As realtors, we love to talk. But one of the things that have come out of this conversation about fair housing is that now is an incredibly important time to listen. To listen to those who have fought fair housing issues, discrimination and biases for centuries. To listen to their experiences. To share your own with each other. Because only then can we emerge out of this. It's going to take time. It's going to take evolution. But you, on an individual basis, are a shining light in that path.
Kevin Brown has an incredible personal story of his family's overcoming discrimination to break the color line within a neighborhood that had racially restrictive covenants. He ends by asking all realtors to get involved in the fight for fair housing.
Hi, I'm Kevin Brown. Well, real estate wasn't really on my mind when I was in college. I was actually a science major, and in my second year, I decided to change my major. I was in an internship program with a corporation, and they gave me the spiel in my senior year about come work for us, we'll pay for you to get an MBA and so forth. But I didn't want to be confined in a box. I had an entrepreneurial spirit. I've been watching my father and my brother for the last several years. They were doing really well in real estate, and I thought it would be really cool to go into the business and give it a shot. So I asked my father, and he welcomed me with open arms. Well, my housing story is that my parents, they've always owned a home, and during my lifetime. And when I was first born, they were renters. But the year I was born, they had a lot of obstacles in their way when it comes to housing. They wanted to move out of the area that they were living in, and they couldn't get a loan. And this was in Oakland, California. And some of the other barriers that were in their way is that the areas they were looking in, there were CC&Rs in place. It was a predominantly white area, but there were CC&Rs that were in place that prevented blacks and other minorities from purchasing a home in that area. So what my father did is he found a foreclosure. He approached the owner, and the owner, of course, knew these CC&Rs were in place, but he was in financial distress. And he told my father, if you can pay me cash, I'm going to sell this land to you. I don't care what color you are. And so my father paid cash for the land. And then my father and another contractor friend of his built his house. They built the house that I grew up in. And so that was a real great experience for me. And I learned from an early age that you don't always pay for everything. My parents really took pride in this house because they built it themselves, and they went out and did all the yard work themselves, and they had us do the yard work. And just so long as they paid their mortgage, nobody could throw them out. And they had a lot of pride of ownership. You really have to start from the beginning. For hundreds of years, African Americans have been discriminated against in this country. And starting with slavery, pre and post Reconstruction, they were discriminated against in the South heavily after Reconstruction, and terrorized by the Ku Klux Klux Klan. And then even after they passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they still didn't have those rights. And so you go on into the 20th century, and blacks were relegated to certain parts of cities and certain parts of the country. They didn't have the ability to move or to live in other parts. They did migrate, but within the city, they couldn't choose or pick where they lived. They weren't able to buy real estate. Financing wasn't available to them. When FHA started giving loans for white families in the suburbs, blacks were eliminated from a lot of those policies. So that's why there is a big discrepancy in home ownership between blacks and whites. There's a huge gap, and it's not going to get any better until policies are put into place that are going to help African Americans and other people of color achieve the American dream. People are gradually buying houses, but certainly that gap is not getting any closer. It's actually widening. So right now, I think that we're at a critical stage in the history of our country. There's a lot of racism. On one side, there's a Black Lives Matter movement. And a lot of people really don't understand what that movement is all about. And racism, by definition, is differential treatment, differential policies for people of different races. And so what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to point out is that that blacks are being treated historically different than whites, and that they are entitled to equal justice and equal equality in housing and all the other benefits that whites are entitled to in this country. And that has not happened over hundreds of years. It hasn't happened. And finally, there's a rallying cry. And one of the things that I'm really happy to see is that it's not just blacks that are on the street. There's blacks, there's whites, there's Hispanics, there's Asians, there's people of all minorities coming to the call for equality and justice for all. Something that hasn't existed in this country for minorities, and it's never existed. And I think that, housing is one of the things that's at the center of this. And one of the things that C.A.R. can do is to help educate its members. I challenge everybody in this organization to come together. And it might be an uneven discussion. It might be a rocky or bumpy road. Everybody is not going to agree with everything, but at least we can have the conversation. So I urge you, if you want to talk to me, if you want to talk to the leadership team, if you want to talk to anybody at C.A.R., I encourage you to start the discussion, and let's help solve some of these problems.
C.A.R. would like to thank Matt DeFanis, Eva Garcia, Karen Ruth, Lolita Smith, Doug Sager, and Kevin Brown for sharing your powerful, heartfelt stories. As an industry, we still have so much more to do, and there are things that every single realtor can do to promote fair housing in their businesses and join the effort to close homeownership gaps. First, we can all make sure that we understand how implicit bias works by watching Bias Override: Barriers to Fair Housing. That's NAR's implicit bias training video. Also consider using systems like buyer questionnaires to ensure consistent treatment of all buyers. First-time home buyer programs can be instrumental in helping buyers with less access to inherited wealth. So learning more about these programs can help you better serve buyers and inform sellers. Find out more by viewing C.A.R.'s financial webinars or attending C.A.R.'s Steps Toward Homeownership. Another great way to learn is to read more about fair housing. Try reading The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein and taking NAR's Fair Haven training. You may also consider joining or attending events sponsored by multicultural real estate trade organizations like the California Association of Real Estate Brokers, the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, the Asian American Real Estate Association of America, or the LGBTQ+ Real Estate Alliance. Finally, many local associations have or are forming diversity and fair housing committees. Check with your local association to discover fair housing events, webinars, and training they are hosting. And since it's Ledge Day, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the power of your voices. Look for opportunities to support fair housing laws and participate in calls for action at the national, state, and local level. Fair housing issues have been persistent, but together we can and we will make real change. Thank you for watching.